place is in the trash," my daughter said as she pointed toward the garbage cans beside the driveway. And somehow those 6 words hurt more than losing my husband 3 months earlier. The rain had just started falling over the quiet suburban street, turning the yellow porch light into a blurry glow across the wet pavement. My suitcase lay tipped over beside a torn garbage bag, one of my sweaters halfway hanging out into a puddle. Vanessa stood in the doorway with her arms crossed tightly against her chest like she had been waiting years for this moment. Behind her, my son-in-law Brian avoided looking at me entirely. He stared at the hardwood floor inside the house, as if that would somehow excuse his silence. I remember gripping the handle of my suitcase so hard my fingers started trembling, but I refused to cry. Not in front of her. Not after everything I had done for that family. "Mom," Vanessa said again, her voice colder now. "You can't stay here anymore. Dad is gone, and this house is too expensive for dead weight." Dead weight? I stared at my own daughter and barely recognized the woman standing in front of me. At 42, Vanessa had perfected the polished smile of someone who knew how to look charming in public while quietly destroying people behind closed doors. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled even at 9 o'clock at night. Her manicured nails rested against the doorway Harold himself had painted 20 years ago. Everything about her looked calm and controlled while my entire world collapsed on the front lawn. I glanced past her shoulder into the house that had once been mine. The living room lamp still glowed softly beside Harold's recliner. His reading glasses were still sitting on the side table exactly where he had left them before the heart attack took him on a cold January morning. 37 years of marriage reduced to a few cardboard boxes and one suitcase sitting beside the trash. "I'll only take a few more things," I said quietly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Vanessa laughed under her breath. Maybe he would remind Vanessa that I had helped pay for their first apartment after they got married. Maybe he would remember the Christmases I spent cooking 12-hour dinners while they relaxed in the den drinking wine. Maybe he would remember the nights I stayed awake with their daughter Sophie when she had pneumonia at 6 years old because Vanessa claimed hospitals made her anxious. But Brian said nothing. Silence can break a heart faster than screaming ever could. The rain started coming down harder then, tapping softly against the roof of Harold's old Ford pickup parked in the driveway. My husband used to joke that the truck would outlive all of us. Standing there alone at 68 years old, I suddenly believed him. Vanessa stepped outside carefully, avoiding the puddles in her expensive beige heels. She held a small cardboard box in her hands and shoved it toward me carelessly. "You forgot this junk in the attic." The box slipped from her fingers and hit the driveway with a dull crack. Old photographs scattered across the wet concrete. A picture of Harold holding Vanessa at Disney World when she was 7 floated face down into a puddle. Another photo showed the 4 of us on Cape Cod during the summer of 1998, smiling in front of the ocean before life became complicated and cruel. Vanessa didn't even glance at them. But I did, because mothers notice everything, even when their children stop noticing them. I bent slowly to gather the photographs before the rain ruined them completely. My knees ached sharply from arthritis, but I ignored the pain. That was when I saw it. Buried beneath a stack of old birthday cards and faded receipts sat a tiny wooden box no larger than a jewelry case. Breath caught instantly. Harold's box. I hadn't seen it in years. My fingers froze around it as memories rushed back all at once. 3 weeks before he died, Harold had placed that box into my hands while we sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee after midnight. The whole house had been dark except for the stove light above us. "Promise me something, Eleanor," he had said quietly. His voice had sounded tired back then, though neither of us wanted to admit how sick he really was becoming. "If anything ever feels wrong after I'm gone, open this." I remember laughing softly at the time. "Harold, stop talking like that." But he only smiled sadly and pressed the box into my hands. "Promise me." I promised. Then I tucked the little box away in the attic and never thought about it again. Until now. Rainwater dripped from my hair onto the wooden lid as I stared at it in disbelief. Vanessa crossed her arms impatiently. "Are you done?" she snapped. "Some of us actually have work tomorrow." I slowly stood back up with the box pressed tightly against my chest. For the first time that night, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there. The humiliation was still there. But underneath both of them, something colder began taking shape. Because suddenly I remembered the strange expression on Harold's face during those final weeks. I remembered how often he asked questions about finances whenever Vanessa left the room. I remembered catching him quietly removing papers from the filing cabinet late at night after everyone else had gone to bed. I assumed grief and illness were clouding his mind. Now I wasn't so sure. Vanessa stepped backward toward the front door. "You should probably find a motel," she said casually. "And Mom, don't try making this harder than it needs to be." Then she closed the door in my face. Just like that. The sound echoed through the rainy night while I stood frozen on the driveway staring at the house where I had raised my daughter, celebrated birthdays, buried my husband, and spent nearly 4 decades building a family that no longer seemed to want me. Upstairs, a bedroom light flickered on briefly. Sophie, my 16-year-old granddaughter, pulled back the curtain just enough for me to see her face. Her eyes looked red like she had been crying. For 1 second, she pressed her hand softly against the window. Then the curtain closed again. I loaded my suitcase into Harold's old truck with shaking hands. The engine struggled twice before finally starting. The dashboard clock glowed 9:47 p.m. as windshield wipers dragged across the rain-covered glass. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, too exhausted to think clearly. Then I looked down at the wooden box resting in the passenger seat beside me. A small brass key was taped underneath it. My pulse quickened instantly, because I recognized the logo engraved on the key. First National Bank Downtown. Safe deposit vaults. Harold had left me something. And whatever it was, Vanessa clearly had no idea it existed. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before I realized I had no idea where I was going. The rain kept falling steadily across the windshield while Harold's old truck rattled softly beneath me like it was struggling to stay alive one more winter. Downtown lights blurred across the wet glass as I passed closed diners, gas stations, and dark storefronts that looked strangely unfamiliar even though I had lived in Cedar Hill for over 30 years. Funny how a town can suddenly feel foreign the moment you no longer have a home inside it. My fingers stayed wrapped tightly around the steering wheel while the little wooden box sat untouched in the passenger seat beside me. Every few seconds, I glanced at it again just to make sure it was real. Harold had left me something. Somehow, even after all these months, that thought still felt impossible. I finally pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store and parked beneath a flickering light near the edge of the lot. The rain tapped softly against the roof while tired shoppers pushed carts through puddles toward their cars. Nobody looked at me twice. To them, I was just another tired older woman sitting alone in a truck after dark. Could not see the way my entire life had cracked open in less than an hour. I leaned back slowly against the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. The exhaustion hit me all at once then. Not just physical exhaustion. Something deeper. The kind that settles into your bones after months of pretending everything is still normal when it stopped being normal a long time ago. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs much earlier. The truth is, the house started changing almost immediately after Harold died. Not physically at first. Emotionally. Quietly. Like warmth slowly leaving a room after someone opens a window in winter. During the first week after the funeral, Vanessa insisted on staying with me to help out. That was how she phrased it every time someone called. "I'm staying with Mom for a while to help her through this difficult period." People praised her for it constantly. Church friends called her thoughtful. Neighbors said Harold would be proud to see his daughter taking care of me. I smiled and thanked them because that was easier than explaining the strange feeling growing in my chest every day she stayed in the house. First, the changes were small. Vanessa reorganized the kitchen cabinets because she said my system made no sense anymore. She removed Harold's jackets from the front hallway closet because seeing them every day was preventing healthy grieving. One afternoon, I came downstairs and found she had boxed up most of our family photographs from the living room shelves. The clutter was depressing, she explained casually while scrolling through her phone. I remember standing there holding one framed picture from our trip to Maine in 2004 while she continued typing messages like nothing important had happened. "I like those pictures," I said quietly. Vanessa barely looked up. "Mom, you cannot live in the past forever." The strange thing was not what she said. It was how quickly the house stopped feeling like mine afterward. Little by little, my routines disappeared. Harold and I always drank coffee together in the kitchen around 6 in the morning while listening to local radio. 2 weeks after the funeral, Vanessa replaced the old radio with a small white speaker that played podcasts about business and productivity. "The old things sounded ancient," she said. She painted the downstairs bathroom pale gray because beige was dated. She hired landscapers without asking me because she thought Harold's flower beds looked messy. Every decision arrived wrapped inside the same polished smile. Helpful, reasonable, efficient. But beneath all of it was something colder, something territorial. Brian stayed mostly quiet through those early months. He worked long hours at the accounting firm downtown and rarely involved himself in family tension. Sometimes I caught him watching Vanessa carefully after she spoke to me sharply, like part of him recognized something was wrong but lacked the courage to challenge it. Other times he looked exhausted before he even walked through the front door. Their marriage had changed too. I noticed that much immediately. They barely touched each other anymore. Most evenings Vanessa sat at the kitchen island with her laptop open while Brian ate dinner silently in front of the television upstairs. The warmth between them seemed gone, replaced by schedules, bills, and whispered arguments behind closed doors. Then there was Sophie. Sweet Sophie. Out of everyone in that house, she was the only one who still treated me like family. At 16 years old, she had Harold's gentle eyes and quiet way of noticing things other people missed. Some nights after Vanessa went upstairs, Sophie would sit beside me in the living room pretending to do homework while we watched old game shows together. She never directly asked if I was okay. Teenagers rarely do. But sometimes she would squeeze my hand briefly before going upstairs, and somehow that small gesture meant everything. About a month after Harold passed away, I walked into the kitchen late one night and overheard Vanessa speaking on the phone. She did not realize I was standing in the hallway. The property value alone is worth almost $800,000 now, she whispered sharply. There was a pause while someone responded. No, she still thinks everything belongs to her. But trust me, once the paperwork is sorted out, that house is getting sold. I stood frozen beside the hallway wall while my stomach tightened painfully. Sold. She was talking about my home like it was already hers. A floorboard creaked beneath my foot before I could stop myself. Vanessa turned instantly, her expression changing so quickly it almost frightened me. 1 second irritation. The next second concern. Mom, she said smoothly. You should be sleeping. I asked who she had been talking to. She smiled immediately. Just a realtor friend asking about market trends. Nothing important. But after that night, things became harder to ignore. Documents started disappearing from Harold's office. Vanessa frequently asked strange questions about insurance policies, retirement accounts, and property taxes. Twice I caught her searching through filing cabinets while she assumed I was upstairs asleep. One afternoon, I discovered the lock on Harold's old desk had been replaced entirely. The drawer kept sticking, she explained casually. I almost believed her. Grief does strange things to the mind. It makes you question your own instincts. Part of me kept wanting to think I was imagining everything, because the alternative was too painful. Nobody wants to believe their own child is quietly pushing them out of their life. Especially not after losing the person who held the family together for nearly 4 decades. The hardest moments always came at dinner. Harold used to fill silence effortlessly with stories, jokes, and little observations about neighbors or weather forecasts. Without him there, meals felt hollow. Vanessa often spent dinner scrolling through real estate websites on her tablet while Brian stared at financial reports from work. Sometimes nobody spoke for 10 minutes straight except for the sound of silverware against plates. One evening I mentioned how strange the house felt without Harold. Vanessa sighed heavily and set down her fork. Mom, you really need to start moving forward, she said. This giant house is not realistic for someone your age anyway. Someone your age. I remember those words clearly because they marked the first time I realized she no longer saw me as her mother. It's an obstacle. A problem waiting to be solved. The rain outside the grocery store slowly eased into a light drizzle while I sat alone inside the truck, remembering all of it piece by piece. Looking back, the ending should not have shocked me as much as it did. Vanessa had been preparing for this moment for months. Maybe longer. I looked down again at the brass key taped beneath Harold's wooden box. My reflection stared back faintly from the dark windshield. Pale blue eyes. Silver hair damp from rain. A woman who had spent her entire life believing love and loyalty inside a family were permanent things. Slowly, I reached for the key and held it tightly in my palm. Then I whispered the first honest thought I had allowed myself all night. What did you know, Harold? By midnight, the parking lot had almost emptied completely. Only a few cars remained scattered beneath the tall lights while employees inside the grocery store cleaned floors and stocked shelves for the morning shift. I sat there much longer than I should have, staring at the brass key in my hand while memories kept circling through my mind like restless ghosts. Harold had always been careful with money, careful with paperwork, careful with people. Back when Vanessa was younger, I used to tease him about how suspicious he could be sometimes. He trusted routines more than promises. Every bill paid early. Every account organized neatly inside labeled folders. Every important document locked away where nothing could disappear. People change when money enters the room, he used to say quietly. At the time, I thought he was talking about strangers. Now I wondered if he had been talking about family all along. My stomach growled softly, reminding me I had not eaten since lunch. The idea of food made me feel sick anyway. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 12:14 a.m. There was only one place I could go. Martha Green lived less than 10 minutes away in a small brick ranch house near the edge of town. We had been neighbors for nearly 20 years before she moved after retiring from the elementary school district. Martha was one of those rare people who noticed everything without being cruel about it. Kind of woman who remembered birthdays, mailed handwritten Christmas cards, and quietly brought casseroles to grieving families without needing praise for it. During Harold's funeral reception, she had hugged me tightly in the church kitchen and whispered, "Call me if you need anything." I mean that. At the time, I smiled politely because people always say things like that after funerals. Tonight, for the first time, I actually needed someone. The roads were nearly empty as I drove across town. Rainwater shimmered beneath the streetlights while old country songs played softly through the truck radio. Harold loved late-night drives. Sometimes during the early years of our marriage, we would leave Vanessa sleeping at my mother's house and drive nowhere in particular just to escape responsibilities for a few hours. Cheap coffee, quiet roads, windows cracked open during summer storms. Back then, life felt endless. Funny how quickly forever disappears. Martha answered the door wearing a pale blue bathrobe and reading glasses. The moment she saw me standing there soaked from rain with a suitcase beside me, her entire expression changed. She did not ask questions immediately. She simply stepped aside and said softly, "Come inside, Eleanor." That kindness nearly broke me more than Vanessa's cruelty had. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon tea and laundry detergent. Warmth wrapped around me instantly after the cold rain outside. Martha took my coat without speaking and disappeared briefly into the kitchen. A minute later, she returned carrying a towel and a steaming mug of chamomile tea. My hands shook slightly as I wrapped them around the warmth. I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Martha hesitated carefully like she was deciding how much truth I could handle tonight. "About 6 weeks ago, I ran into Vanessa at the home improvement store. She was with a realtor." My pulse quickened instantly. "A realtor?" Martha nodded slowly. "I overheard them talking about renovations and resale value. At first I assumed she was helping you prepare the house for downsizing." Downsizing. Another polite word people use when they mean pushing older people out of their lives. Martha's expression darkened slightly. But then she said something strange. I waited silently. She told the realtor the property would officially be hers very soon. A cold heaviness settled into my chest. Somehow hearing it spoken aloud made everything feel more real, more deliberate. Martha reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "Eleanor, I almost called you afterward, but I thought maybe I misunderstood." "No," I whispered quietly. "You understood perfectly." We sat there for a while listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and distant thunder outside. Eventually Martha stood and prepared the guest room without another question. The kindness of that nearly undid me. Vanessa had spent months making me feel unwanted inside my own home. Martha managed to make me feel safe again in less than 20 minutes. The guest room overlooked a small backyard lined with oak trees dripping rainwater beneath the porch light. Martha placed folded towels at the foot of the bed and quietly closed the door behind her. For the first time all night, I was alone. Truly alone. I sat carefully on the edge of the mattress and looked around the small room. Floral curtains, quilted blankets, a framed watercolor painting of a lighthouse hanging beside the closet. Everything felt peaceful in a way my own house had not felt for months. Slowly, I reached inside my purse and removed Harold's wooden box again. The brass key glinted softly beneath the bedside lamp. My heart started beating faster as I turned the box over carefully in my hands. There was something else now that I had not noticed before. Tiny initials carved underneath the lid. H. W. Harold Whitmore. My fingers traced the letters gently. Then I opened the box completely for the first time since finding it in the rain. Inside rested a folded piece of paper, yellowed slightly with age. My breath caught as I unfolded it carefully. Harold's handwriting stared back at me immediately. Strong, precise, familiar enough to make my chest ache instantly. Eleanor, if you are reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. I stopped breathing for a moment. My eyes moved slowly across the page. I know you will want to believe the best about Vanessa. You always do. But there are things I discovered during the past year that I could not ignore. Please trust me now, even if it hurts. The room suddenly felt colder despite the blankets wrapped around my shoulders. My hands trembled slightly as I continued reading. I have placed documents in safe deposit box 214 at First National Bank. Everything you need is there. Do not discuss this with Vanessa or Brian until you speak with Howard Bennett first. He already knows. Howard Bennett, Harold's attorney. I stared at the letter in stunned silence while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. Howard had handled our estate planning for years. He and Harold played golf together every summer. If Harold trusted him enough to write his name here, then whatever waited inside that safe deposit box was serious. Very serious. Then my eyes reached the final sentence on the page, and suddenly the entire room seemed to tilt around me. Eleanor, the house does not belong to Vanessa. In fact, if she ever attempts to force you out or sell the property against your wishes, she may lose everything entirely. I read the sentence 3 times before it fully settled into my mind. Lose everything. A strange mixture of fear and relief washed through me all at once. Harold had known. Somehow, before he died, he had already seen what was coming. I looked down again at his familiar handwriting while tears finally gathered in my eyes for the first time that night. Not because I felt weak, because suddenly, after hours of humiliation and confusion and heartbreak, I realized something important. Harold had not left me helpless. He had left me protected. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa standing in the doorway with that cold expression on her face while rain soaked through my clothes on the driveway. Then I would hear Harold's voice again from years earlier, calm and steady the way it always was whenever life became difficult. Pay attention to what people do when they think you are vulnerable, Ellie. He used to call me Ellie when we were alone together. Nobody else ever did. Around 6 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and walked quietly into Martha's kitchen. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains while the coffee maker hummed softly on the counter. Martha was already awake, wearing jeans and an old green sweatshirt from Cedar Hill Elementary. She glanced up from the newspaper the moment I entered. "You look like you slept about 10 minutes, she said gently. I managed a tired smile. That obvious? Martha poured coffee into a mug and slid it across the table toward me without another word. I wrapped both hands around the warmth while my thoughts kept circling back to Harold's letter hidden upstairs inside my purse. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that my husband had spent his final months quietly preparing for something he never fully explained to me. And somehow that realization hurt almost as much as Vanessa's betrayal itself, because it meant Harold had been carrying fear alone while pretending everything was fine. Finally folded her newspaper carefully and looked directly at me. "What are you going to do?" I stared into my coffee for several seconds before answering. "I am going downtown to the bank." She nodded once like she already expected that answer. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No," I said softly. "I think I need to do this part alone." The drive downtown felt strangely unreal the next morning. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the streets damp beneath bright spring sunlight. Commuters hurried through intersections carrying coffee cups, while shop owners unlocked storefronts along Main Street. Life moved normally around me while mine felt split cleanly into before and after. Before Harold died. Before Vanessa changed. Before I became unwanted inside my own home. First National Bank stood near the center of downtown in a large stone building that had barely changed since the 1970s. Harold loved that bank because he trusted institutions that still used paper ledgers and knew customers by name. Walking through those glass doors without him beside me felt painfully wrong somehow. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old carpet. A young teller smiled politely as I approached the counter. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" My voice sounded smaller than usual when I answered. "I need access to safe deposit box 214. The teller typed something into her computer, then looked up again. Do you have the key and identification? I handed both over carefully. The moment she saw the brass key, her expression shifted slightly. Not suspicious. Respectful. One moment, Mrs. Moore. She disappeared through a back hallway and returned less than a minute later with an older man in a navy suit. Silver hair. Thin glasses. Calm eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, he said gently, extending his hand. I am Daniel Reeves, the branch manager. I was very sorry to hear about your husband. I thanked him quietly while a strange nervousness tightened in my chest. He escorted me personally through a secured hallway into the vault area downstairs. Thick steel doors, bright fluorescent lights, cold air carrying the faint metallic smell unique to old banks. Everything about the room felt heavy with secrets. Daniel unlocked a long rectangular box from the wall and placed it carefully onto a private viewing table. Take as much time as you need, he said kindly before leaving me alone. For several seconds, I simply stared at the box without touching it. My heartbeat sounded loud inside the silent room. Then slowly, I inserted Harold's brass key and opened the lid. Inside sat 3 large manila envelopes stacked neatly beside a small black videotape recorder drive. Top rested another handwritten note from Harold. My throat tightened immediately at the sight of his familiar handwriting again. Ellie, if you are here, then I was right to worry. I need you to stay calm and trust Howard completely. Everything has already been prepared. Prepared. The word sent a chill through me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first envelope. Property trust documents. Legal paperwork. Bank records. I recognized Howard Bennett's signature near the bottom of several pages. Most of the legal language blurred together at first, but one phrase kept appearing repeatedly. Irrevocable family trust. I frowned, trying to understand what I was reading. Then my eyes landed on a highlighted paragraph near the center of one document. The Cedar Hill property located at 114 Willow Creek Drive shall remain under sole residential protection rights for Eleanor Whitmore for the duration of her lifetime. Forced displacement, coercion, unauthorized sale attempts, or financial manipulation by secondary beneficiaries shall result in immediate forfeiture of inheritance rights. I read the paragraph twice before the meaning fully settled into place. Vanessa could not legally force me out of the house. Worse for her, attempting to do so triggered consequences Harold had already built directly into the trust itself. My pulse quickened sharply. There was more. Much more. I opened the second envelope and felt my stomach drop instantly. Inside were printed bank statements and photocopies of withdrawal forms tied to several joint family accounts. Certain signatures had been circled in red ink. Vanessa's signatures. Some matched perfectly. Others looked subtly different. Forced. Altered. Besides several documents, Harold had written notes in careful black pen. Unauthorized transfer. Verify with Howard. Did not approve. A cold heaviness spread through my chest. Vanessa had not simply wanted control of the house. She had already been moving money quietly behind the scenes while Harold was still alive. Suddenly, fragmented memories started reconnecting themselves inside my mind. Harold sitting silently at the dining room table reviewing statements late at night. Harold canceling a planned vacation without explanation. Harold growing strangely guarded whenever Vanessa discussed finances around him. Dear God, he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. My hands shook harder now as I reached for the final envelope. Inside was a sealed letter addressed directly to Vanessa in Harold's handwriting. Across the front he had written, "To be delivered only if Eleanor is removed from the home against her will." I stared at the envelope for a long moment without breathing properly. Then I noticed the small black drive resting beside the paperwork. A handwritten label read simply, "For Eleanor." Slowly, I inserted it into the small monitor mounted beside the viewing table. Static flickered briefly across the screen before Harold appeared sitting inside his office at home. My breath caught instantly. He looked thinner than I remembered. Paler. But his eyes were steady and focused directly into the camera. "Ellie," he said softly. Hearing his voice again nearly shattered me. I pressed my hand against my mouth while tears blurred my vision immediately. Harold adjusted slightly in his chair before continuing. "If you are watching this, then something happened exactly the way I feared it might." He paused briefly, like choosing his next words carefully. "I need you to listen to me now, sweetheart. None of this is your fault." Tears slid silently down my face while I stared at the screen. Harold leaned forward slightly. Over the last year, I discovered irregular financial activity connected to Vanessa. Missing funds, unauthorized transfers, debt notices she tried to intercept before you could see them. My entire body went still. Debt notices. Suddenly, I remembered strange phone calls Vanessa always answered privately. Packages arriving addressed only to her. Arguments with Brian about credit cards whispered late at night upstairs. Harold continued speaking calmly. I confronted her once. She denied everything, but afterward I started protecting assets quietly. Just in case. Just in case. Those 3 words echoed through the silent vault room while my heart pounded harder with every passing second. Then Harold's expression softened painfully. I hoped I was wrong, Ellie. God help me, I wanted to be wrong. He looked away briefly before facing the camera again. But if she has forced you out of that house, then I was not wrong at all. I stayed inside the vault room for nearly 40 minutes after the video ended. The screen had already gone black, but I still sat there staring at my own reflection faintly visible against the dark monitor while Harold's final words echoed through my mind. He knew. Somehow my husband had carried this terrible knowledge quietly during the final year of his life, while still sitting beside Vanessa at Thanksgiving dinners and smiling through family photographs like nothing was wrong. That realization hurt in ways I could barely explain, because Harold had always believed family could survive almost anything if people loved each other enough. Watching him prepare legal protections against his own daughter felt like discovering an old wound hidden beneath the foundation of our entire marriage. Eventually, I wiped my face carefully and gathered the documents back into their envelopes. My hands no longer trembled the way they had earlier. Something inside me had shifted during that video. The confusion was fading now. In its place came clarity. Cold, painful clarity. Vanessa had not acted impulsively during our argument the night before. She had been building toward that moment for months, maybe years. Every missing document, every subtle insult, every conversation about downsizing and property taxes and practical living arrangements. It was never concern. It was strategy. Daniel Reeves was waiting politely near the hallway when I finally emerged from the vault room, carrying the envelopes pressed tightly against my chest. One look at my face seemed to tell him enough. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "would you like a private office for a few minutes?" I shook my head slowly. "No, thank you." My voice sounded steadier than I expected. Daniel hesitated briefly before speaking again. "Your husband came here several times during the past year." My eyes lifted toward him immediately. "He did." Daniel nodded. Mr. Whitmore was very organized, very careful. He wanted to ensure certain documents stayed protected. Protected. Even now, Harold was still trying to take care of me. The thought nearly brought fresh tears to my eyes. I thanked Daniel quietly and walked back outside into the bright morning sunlight. Downtown Cedar Hill looked almost cheerful beneath the clear blue sky. A delivery truck unloaded flowers outside the grocery market. Someone laughed near the coffee shop across the street. Life kept moving normally around me while mine felt transformed completely in less than 12 hours. I sat inside Harold's truck for several moments before reaching for my phone. There was only one person I needed to speak to next. Howard Bennett answered on the second ring. "Eleanor." His voice immediately softened with concern. "I have been waiting for your call." My grip tightened around the phone instantly. "You knew?" Silence filled the line briefly before he answered carefully. I knew Harold was worried. Closed my eyes for a moment. "Can we meet?" "Of course," Howard replied gently. "Come by the office at 1 o'clock. "And Eleanor?" "Yes." Howard stood the moment I entered. At 72, he still carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who spent decades settling difficult situations without raising his voice. Framed law degrees lined the walls behind him, while sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking downtown. "Eleanor," he said softly, stepping around his desk. "I am very sorry things unfolded this way." That sentence told me everything before we even sat down. He already knew Vanessa had thrown me out. I lowered myself carefully into the leather chair across from his desk and placed Harold's envelopes in front of me. "How long?" I asked quietly. Howard removed his glasses slowly. "Harold first approached me about concerns roughly 14 months ago." 14 months. The number hit me hard. Harold had been carrying suspicion for more than a year, while I remained completely unaware. Why did he not tell me? My voice cracked slightly despite my effort to stay calm. Howard looked genuinely sad. "Because he loved you." I frowned weakly. That does not make sense. Actually, Howard said softly, it makes perfect sense. Folded his hands carefully across the desk before continuing. Harold believed if he told you directly, you would confront Vanessa immediately. He worried you would either dismiss his concerns out of guilt or create a permanent fracture in the family before he had proof. I looked away toward the window because deep down I knew Howard was right. Even now, after everything Vanessa had done, part of me still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. Mothers are foolish that way sometimes. We spend decades forgiving our children long after they stop deserving it. Howard opened one of the envelopes and reviewed several documents quietly before sliding a file toward me. Your husband created the Whitmore Family Trust approximately 11 months ago. I stared down at the paperwork while he continued speaking in his calm, measured tone. The house legally remains protected under your lifetime residency rights. Vanessa cannot sell it, transfer ownership, refinance it, or remove you from the property without triggering serious legal consequences. My heartbeat quickened again. What kind of consequences? Howard's expression hardened slightly for the first time since I arrived. Complete forfeiture of inheritance. Silence settled heavily between us. I blinked slowly. Complete. Everything, Howard confirmed quietly. The house, investment accounts, retirement distributions, insurance assets. Harold structured the trust very carefully. I leaned back in stunned silence while pieces finally started falling into place. Vanessa believed she already controlled the future. She thought removing me from the house gave her power. In reality, she may have destroyed her entire inheritance the moment she forced me onto that driveway. Howard opened another folder and slid several printed documents toward me. Credit reports, debt summaries, collection notices. My stomach tightened instantly. What is all this? Vanessa's financial history. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. Credit card debt, personal loans, missed payments. Nearly $180,000 spread across multiple accounts and lenders. Dear God, I whispered. Howard nodded grimly. Harold discovered portions of this gradually. Several unauthorized transfers were traced back to shared family accounts. Suddenly, memories from the previous year flashed through my mind all over again. Vanessa insisting certain bills had already been paid. Vanessa intercepting mail before anyone else saw it. Vanessa constantly talking about market timing and investment opportunities and cash flow problems. I looked back down at the debt statements while a terrible realization slowly settled over me. She was desperate. That desperation explained everything. The pressure, the manipulation, the obsession with the house. Harold's trust fund represented salvation to her. Except she had moved too quickly, too aggressively. Howard leaned forward slightly. Eleanor, there is something else you need to know. His tone changed just enough to make my stomach tighten again. Vanessa contacted a realtor 3 weeks ago regarding preliminary sale discussions. I stared at him in disbelief. 3 weeks ago? Harold had been dead only 3 months. Howard nodded once. She also attempted to access additional trust information through a private financial consultant. A strange numbness spread through me then. Not shock anymore. Something colder. More final. Because suddenly I understood the truth clearly for the first time. Vanessa had not simply become selfish after Harold died. This started long before his funeral. Long before the arguments. Long before the rainy night, she threw my suitcase beside the garbage cans. She had already been planning her future inside that house while her father was still alive. Howard watched me carefully across the desk. What would you like to do now? I sat quietly for several seconds while sunlight stretched slowly across the office carpet. Outside the window, people walked peacefully along Main Street, carrying shopping bags and iced coffees beneath the warm afternoon sky. Ordinary people living ordinary days. They had no idea that somewhere nearby a daughter had quietly tried to erase her own mother from her life for money. Finally, I looked back at Howard and heard my own voice answer with surprising calm. I think, I said softly, I would like to go home. I sat inside Harold's truck for nearly 5 full minutes after leaving Howard's office before finally turning the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled softly beneath me while afternoon sunlight poured across the dashboard, warm and golden like any ordinary spring day. But nothing about my life felt ordinary anymore. Less than 24 hours earlier, I believed I was a grieving widow being pushed aside by her own daughter because I had become inconvenient. Now I understood something much darker. Vanessa had not simply wanted distance from me. She had been racing toward ownership, toward control, toward money she believed was already hers. And somehow, despite all the lies and manipulation, Harold had managed to stay 2 steps ahead of her until the very end. I drove slowly through downtown Cedar Hill while memories crowded my mind one after another. Vanessa at 12 years old crying after her first middle school dance because another girl mocked her dress. Vanessa at 16 hugging Harold after he surprised her with driving lessons in the old Ford truck. Vanessa walking down the aisle at her wedding with tears in her eyes while Harold whispered proudly, "That is my little girl." Where had that girl gone? Or maybe the more painful question was whether she had ever truly existed the way we believed she did. By the time I turned onto Willow Creek Drive, my heartbeat had become painfully steady. Not racing, not panicked, calm. The kind of calm that settles over people after the shock finally burns away and leaves only truth behind. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Freshly cut lawns, American flags hanging from porches, children riding bicycles near the cul-de-sac at the end of the street. Life continuing normally while my family quietly collapsed behind closed doors. Harold always loved this neighborhood because he said it felt safe. I wondered what he would think if he could see it now. As I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked near the garage. Realtor. The realization came instantly. Through the front window, I could see movement inside the living room. 2 women standing near the fireplace, talking while Vanessa gestured dramatically around the room. My stomach tightened hard. She had already started showing the house. Less than 24 hours after throwing me out. For several seconds, I remained seated inside the truck, gripping the steering wheel while old instincts fought against new understanding inside my chest. Part of me still wanted to avoid conflict, to turn around, to disappear quietly somewhere and let everyone else believe whatever they wanted about me. But another part of me remembered Harold sitting in that video, looking directly into the camera. "None of this is your fault, Ellie." Slowly, I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door carrying my purse and the folder Howard had given me. My shoes crunched softly across the gravel, while sunlight reflected sharply against the windows of the house I had spent nearly 4 decades building into a home. Before I could even reach the porch, the front door swung open. Vanessa froze the moment she saw me standing there. Her expression shifted instantly from confident irritation to visible shock. Beside her stood a sharply dressed brunette woman holding a leather folder and a tablet. Realtor. Vanessa recovered quickly, crossing her arms tightly against her chest. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. Not hello. Not are you all right. Just immediate anger that I had returned at all. I looked past her into the house. The living room furniture had already been rearranged slightly. Decorative pillows replaced ours on the sofa. Fresh white flowers sat on the dining table where Harold used to read the newspaper every Sunday morning. The place looked staged already, like my life had become a showroom. "I live here," I answered quietly. The realtor glanced awkwardly between us. Vanessa forced a quick smile toward her. "Claire, would you give us 1 second?" The woman nodded uncomfortably and stepped toward the kitchen while pretending to check something on her tablet. The moment she disappeared, Vanessa's expression hardened completely. "Mom, we already discussed this." "No," I said calmly. "You spoke. I listened." That seemed to catch her off guard briefly. Vanessa had always depended on emotional reactions. Tears, defensiveness, guilt. She expected weakness because weakness gave her control. What she did not expect was calm. "You cannot just come back whenever you feel like it," she snapped quietly. "Brian and I need space right now." I looked directly into her eyes for the first time since the driveway. "This house belongs to me, Vanessa." Her jaw tightened immediately. "Actually, according to Dad's estate, I met with Howard Bennett this afternoon." Silence. Absolute silence. I watched the color drain subtly from Vanessa's face despite her attempt to stay composed. Tiny things revealed fear if you knew where to look. The slight stiffness in her shoulders. The way her fingers stopped moving. The sudden hesitation behind her eyes. "Howard," she repeated carefully. "Yes." I opened my purse slowly and removed the trust documents. He explained everything. Vanessa stared at the folder in my hands without blinking. For one brief second, I saw it clearly. Panic. Real panic. Then just as quickly, she masked it behind irritation again. "Mom, I think you are confused." "No," I said softly. "I think you hoped I would stay confused." The words hung heavily between us. Somewhere deeper inside the house, a floorboard creaked softly. Brian, listening, watching, hiding upstairs while his wife fought battles he no longer fully understood. Vanessa lowered her voice sharply. This is not the place for legal discussions. Interesting, I replied quietly. Because yesterday seemed like the perfect place to throw your mother onto the lawn. Her face flushed instantly. You are being dramatic. Dramatic. Another favorite word people use when older women stop accepting mistreatment quietly. Before I could answer, movement appeared at the top of the staircase behind her. Sophie stood there frozen halfway down the stairs wearing an oversized sweatshirt and holding her phone tightly against her chest. The moment our eyes met, I saw relief flood her face so quickly it almost broke my heart. Grandma, she whispered. Vanessa spun around immediately. Sophie, go upstairs. But Sophie stayed exactly where she was. Her eyes moved nervously between us before settling back on me. I tried calling you last night, she said softly. Mom took my phone. Vanessa's expression darkened instantly. That is enough. I looked at my granddaughter carefully. The poor child looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying. Suddenly I understood something else clearly for the first time. This situation had been poisoning everyone inside the house for much longer than I realized. Sophie knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. I turned back toward Vanessa calmly. I am staying here tonight. No, you are not. Her answer came too quickly, too desperately. Actually, I said, removing another document from the folder. Under the Whitmore Family Trust, forcing me from this property violates multiple legal protections established by Dad. Vanessa's breathing changed slightly then. Faster, less controlled. You do not understand what you are reading. I understand perfectly. My voice remained quiet. Steady. I also understand there are serious financial consequences attached to coercion and unauthorized sale attempts. That hit exactly where I intended it to. I saw genuine fear flash across her face before she could hide it again. Because now she knew. Howard had told me everything. The realtor suddenly reappeared awkwardly from the kitchen, carrying her tablet. Is everything all right? She asked carefully. Vanessa opened her mouth immediately, but I answered first. Actually, I said politely, the property is not available for sale. Claire blinked in confusion. Oh, I was told. You were given incorrect information. Silence flooded the room. Claire looked between us uncomfortably before lowering her tablet slowly. I think perhaps I should leave. Probably a wise idea, I said gently. Vanessa stood frozen near the staircase while the realtor gathered her things in visible embarrassment. The front door closed quietly behind her a moment later, leaving the three of us standing inside the living room surrounded by silence and sunlight and years of buried resentment finally rising to the surface. Then from upstairs, Brian's voice finally spoke for the first time all afternoon. Vanessa, he said quietly, what exactly did your father put in that trust? The silence after Brian's question felt heavier than shouting ever could. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor while nobody moved for several long seconds. Vanessa stood perfectly still near the staircase, gripping the edge of the banister so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Sophie remained halfway downstairs watching her parents with frightened eyes that suddenly looked much younger than 16. And me? I simply stood there holding Harold's trust documents against my chest while years of confusion slowly transformed into understanding. Brian finally descended the staircase slowly, one hand resting against the railing as though he suddenly needed support just to remain standing. Exhausted. Not angry yet. Not fully. But something inside him had shifted the moment I mentioned legal protections and inheritance consequences. For the first time since Harold died, Brian looked less like Vanessa's husband and more like a man realizing he had walked blindly into a situation he never fully understood. Vanessa, he repeated quietly, what exactly did your father put in that trust? She laughed once under her breath, but the sound came out strained and unnatural. Oh my God, Brian, do not start this. Answer the question. His voice remained calm, which somehow made the tension worse. Vanessa looked toward me sharply. You went crying to Howard? I held her gaze steadily. No, I went looking for the truth. That sentence landed harder than I expected. Vanessa's face tightened instantly. The truth, she snapped. You want the truth? Fine. The truth is this house is bleeding money. Property taxes keep rising, maintenance costs are ridiculous, and Dad left everything tied up in outdated legal nonsense, Because he could never accept reality. Reality? Brian asked slowly. Or control? Vanessa turned toward him immediately. Excuse me. Brian rubbed one hand across his face tiredly. You never mentioned a trust. You told me ownership transferred directly after probate. More silence. The kind of silence that reveals things nobody planned to confess. I watched Vanessa carefully then. Watched the calculations moving behind her eyes. Every conversation inside that house over the past year suddenly looked different now. More deliberate. More rehearsed. Sophie descended the remaining stairs quietly and stopped beside the living room archway. Mom, she said softly. Grandma should not have been sleeping in her truck. Vanessa's head snapped toward her daughter immediately. Stay out of this. Sophie flinched slightly, but did not back away. No. The word came out barely above a whisper, but it changed the room instantly. Because for the first time, someone besides me had openly challenged Vanessa inside that house. Brian looked at his daughter carefully. Sophie, he said gently. What do you mean sleeping in her truck? Sophie hesitated briefly before answering. I saw Grandma outside last night after Mom locked the door. Brian slowly turned back toward Vanessa. The expression on his face changed then. Not explosive anger. Something quieter. More dangerous. Disappointment. You told me Eleanor left voluntarily, he said. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. She did leave voluntarily. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that sentence. Instead, I spoke quietly. After my suitcase was thrown beside the garbage cans. Brian's eyes closed briefly, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough to tell me he had not known everything. Vanessa started pacing suddenly across the living room like she needed movement to keep control of herself. You are all acting like I committed some terrible crime, she said sharply. I have spent months trying to hold this family together while dealing with bills and stress and Dad's estate problems completely alone. You were not alone, Brian answered quietly, pushed everyone else away. That hit her harder than any accusation could have. I saw it immediately. Vanessa stopped pacing and stared at him in disbelief. You think this is my fault? Brian looked around the living room slowly. I think something has been wrong here for a very long time. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked softly through the silence that followed. I remembered when Harold bought that clock during our 25th anniversary trip to Vermont. Vanessa was 14 then. She spent the entire drive home complaining the clock smelled old and looked creepy. Harold laughed the whole time and said character mattered more than appearance. Funny how some lessons never take root no matter how often parents repeat them. Sophie quietly walked toward me then. Her eyes looked swollen from crying. Grandma, she whispered softly, I am sorry. My chest tightened painfully. I touched her hand gently. None of this is your fault, sweetheart. Vanessa exhaled sharply in frustration. Can everybody stop acting like I am some monster? Brian looked directly at her, then explained the debt. The room went still again. This time, even Sophie froze beside me. Vanessa's entire posture stiffened instantly. What debt? She asked too quickly. Brian stared at her carefully. Howard called me 2 weeks ago. That surprised all of us. Even Vanessa blinked hard at that. He what? Brian nodded slowly without taking his eyes off her. He asked if I knew about the missing transfers tied to the joint family accounts. My heartbeat quickened immediately. Howard never mentioned contacting Brian directly. I told him there had to be some mistake, Brian continued quietly. Because I trusted you. Vanessa's face lost color gradually while he spoke. Brian, do not. His voice remained calm again, controlled, but underneath it sat months of buried suspicion finally surfacing. I defended you, Vanessa, even when things stopped making sense. Sophie looked between her parents anxiously while sunlight continued pouring through the front windows, bright and almost cruel against the tension filling the room. Outside, somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started humming softly. Ordinary suburban sounds drifting through the collapse of an entire family. Vanessa shook her head slowly like she could still regain control if she talked fast enough. The accounts were temporary adjustments, she insisted. I was going to replace everything after the refinancing went through. Refinancing. Another truth slipping loose before she could stop it. Brian stared at her in disbelief. You tried refinancing the house. She realized her mistake immediately. Too late. I was trying to protect us, she snapped defensively. You have no idea how much pressure we are under right now. Brian's expression darkened. What pressure? Silence. Then finally, for the first time since this nightmare began, Vanessa looked genuinely frightened. Not angry. Not manipulative. Afraid. She sank slowly onto the edge of the sofa and covered her face briefly with both hands. "We are behind," she whispered. Brian frowned deeply. Behind on what? Vanessa looked up again with tears finally gathering in her eyes. Everything. The word barely escaped her throat. Something inside me cracked painfully then because despite everything she had done, this was still my daughter sitting in front of me looking lost and cornered and terrified beneath layers of pride and greed and terrible decisions. Brian stared at her in stunned silence, while she continued speaking rapidly now like the truth had finally broken loose faster than she could control it. Credit cards. Business loans tied to an online retail investment that failed last year. Personal loans she hid hoping she could recover before anyone noticed. Collection notices arriving for months. Minimum payments becoming impossible. Sophie slowly sat beside me looking pale. "Mom," she whispered weakly. "You said everything was fine." Vanessa wiped angrily at her tears. "I was trying to fix it." Brian looked devastated now. More than angry. Betrayed. "By stealing from your parents?" "I did not steal anything." "You forged signatures," Brian answered quietly. "Howard showed me copies." Another silence. Long and terrible. Vanessa's breathing became uneven while she looked around the room desperately, as if searching for someone to rescue her from the consequences finally catching up. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because there was nothing left to defend anymore. The lies had become too large to hold together. Finally, Vanessa looked directly at me for the first time since I walked back into the house. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Dad really planned all this." I thought about Harold sitting alone in his office recording that final video, while sickness slowly stole time from him. I thought about the sadness in his eyes when he admitted he hoped he was wrong. Then I answered honestly. "No. Your father hoped he would never need to." The house felt different after the truth finally entered the room. Not louder. Quieter. Like everyone inside suddenly understood something fragile had broken beyond repair. Vanessa remained standing near the sofa staring at the floor, while sunlight stretched across the living room in long golden lines. Brian had moved toward the kitchen without another word after her confession. I could hear cabinets opening and closing softly while he pretended to busy himself with ordinary things, because sometimes people reach for routine when their entire reality starts collapsing. Sophie sat beside me on the couch, twisting the sleeve of her sweatshirt nervously around her fingers. Nobody knew what came next. I looked around the room slowly. Harold's recliner still sat near the fireplace exactly where he left it. His favorite blanket remained folded neatly over one arm. A half-finished crossword puzzle still rested on the side table beneath his reading lamp. For months I avoided looking at those things too closely because grief made every object feel painfully alive. But now another realization settled quietly into my chest. Harold protected me even after he died. The thought brought both comfort and heartbreak at the same time. Vanessa finally spoke again without lifting her eyes. "How much did Dad tell you?" I answered honestly. "Enough." She swallowed hard. "Did he tell you why?" I stared at her carefully then. "Does it matter?" That question seemed to wound her more deeply than anger would have. Vanessa sat down slowly on the opposite chair and rubbed both hands across her face like exhaustion had finally caught up with her. For the first time in months, she looked older than 42. Not physically, emotionally. Like the weight of every lie she carried had suddenly become visible all at once. "You think I wanted this?" she whispered. Brian reappeared quietly from the kitchen carrying a glass of water he never drank. "I think you stopped talking to us a long time ago," he answered. Vanessa laughed bitterly beneath her breath. "Talking would not have fixed anything." "Maybe not," Brian said softly. "But lying destroyed everything anyway." Sophie looked between her parents silently while tears gathered again in her eyes. I reached over and squeezed her hand gently because no child should ever have to sit inside the ruins of her own family like this. Vanessa finally looked directly at me again. "You have no idea what it feels like waking up every morning terrified someone is going to call about another bill." "Yes." The room went still again. Vanessa frowned weakly. "What?" I looked down at my hands for a moment before speaking. "After Harold died, I woke up every morning terrified too." My voice remained calm. "Not about money. About emptiness." Nobody interrupted. 37 years, I continued quietly. 37 years of hearing his footsteps in the hallway, his voice in the kitchen, his truck pulling into the driveway after work. Then one morning all of it stopped forever. My throat tightened slightly, but I kept speaking anyway. And while I was trying to remember how to exist without him, my own daughter started treating me like furniture she could donate once it became inconvenient. Vanessa flinched visibly. Good. Some truth should hurt. Brian slowly sat down across from us, looking more tired than I had ever seen him. Why did you not tell me how bad things were? He asked quietly. Vanessa looked away immediately. Because I thought I could fix it. By taking money from your parents, you forged signatures. I was going to pay it back. When... Silence again. Long, painful. Honest. Finally, Vanessa whispered the truth neither of them wanted to say out loud. I do not know. Outside, the sound of children playing drifted faintly through the neighborhood. Somewhere down the street, somebody laughed loudly while a dog barked behind a fence. Ordinary life continuing while ours unraveled one confession at a time. Brian leaned forward slowly, resting his elbows against his knees. How much debt are we actually talking about? Vanessa stared at the floor before answering. About 200,000. Sophie inhaled sharply beside me. Even Brian looked physically stunned. $200,000? Vanessa nodded weakly. Some of it came from the online business investment, then credit cards, then the personal loans. Brian stared at her like he no longer recognized the woman sitting across from him. You told me the business was profitable. It was supposed to be. You said we were stable. Vanessa's voice cracked then. I was trying to make us stable. Suddenly Sophie stood up abruptly from beside me. You lied to everybody, she whispered. Tears spilled freely down her face now. You lied to Dad. You lied to Grandma. You lied to Grandpa before he died. Vanessa looked devastated hearing that from her daughter. Sophie, did Grandpa know you were taking money? Sophie asked shakily. Nobody answered immediately. I looked toward Harold's empty chair near the fireplace and remembered the sadness in his recorded message. I hoped I was wrong, Ellie. God help me, I wanted to be wrong. He knew enough to worry, I answered softly. Sophie covered her mouth as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Then without another word, she turned and ran upstairs. A bedroom door closed softly a few seconds later. Not slammed, just closed. Somehow that felt even sadder. Vanessa buried her face briefly in both hands again. Brian looked completely drained now. I cannot believe this, he whispered. I watched both of them quietly for a long moment. Then I realized something important. For months, I thought Vanessa held all the power inside this house. She controlled conversations, decisions, money, emotions. Everyone walked carefully around her moods and reactions because they believed she was managing everything. But sitting there now, I finally saw the truth clearly. Vanessa had not been powerful at all. She had been terrified. Terrified people would discover how deeply everything was falling apart beneath the surface. Terrified of losing the image she built so carefully. Terrified that without money and appearances and control, nobody would admire her anymore. Fear changes people, sometimes into strangers. Brian finally looked toward me again. Eleanor, he said quietly, I am sorry. Those 3 words nearly undid me because they were the first genuine apology anyone had offered since this nightmare began. I nodded slowly. Thank you. Vanessa lifted her head sharply. So what happens now? There it was. The real question beneath all the others. Not guilt. Not regret. Consequences. I thought carefully before answering. That depends on what happens next. She frowned weakly. What does that mean? I stood slowly from the sofa and picked up the folder containing Harold's trust documents. Sunlight caught the edge of the papers while the room remained painfully quiet around us. It means your father gave you a chance even after he suspected the truth, I said calmly. The trust only activates full penalties if coercion continues or additional fraud occurs. Brian looked up immediately. Vanessa blinked in confusion. What are you saying? I met her eyes steadily. I am saying your father hoped this family could still choose honesty before everything became irreversible. For the first time all afternoon, Vanessa looked completely speechless. Because suddenly the future she imagined was no longer guaranteed. Harold had not designed the trust purely as punishment. He designed it as a final warning, a line in the sand. And now every person inside that house understood exactly how close we stood to crossing it forever. That evening nobody touched dinner. Around 6 o'clock, Brian ordered takeout from a small Italian restaurant downtown out of pure habit, but the white paper bag sat unopened on the kitchen counter while the smell of garlic and tomato sauce slowly filled the house. The television remained off. Nobody checked their phones. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, each tick stretching heavily through the silence like a reminder that time was still moving whether our family survived this or not. I sat alone at the dining table for a while watching sunlight fade slowly through the kitchen windows. The house looked different in the evening now. Not physically, emotionally. Like every room had absorbed the weight of the truths finally spoken out loud that afternoon. Upstairs, I could hear faint footsteps crossing the hallway carpet outside Sophie's room. Brian moved around quietly in the garage for nearly an hour pretending to organize tools he had no intention of using. And Vanessa locked herself inside the bedroom she once shared with Harold's little girl Innocence decades earlier. Funny how adulthood sometimes becomes nothing more than children carrying bigger secrets. Eventually, I stood and walked slowly toward Harold's office at the end of the downstairs hallway. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and coffee. His desk remained exactly the way he left it before the heart attack. Pens aligned neatly beside legal pads. Reading glasses folded carefully near the lamp. One faded photograph of the four of us at Yellowstone National Park sitting beside the monitor. Vanessa was 23 in that picture, laughing while Harold pretended to complain about the Buffalo traffic delaying our vacation plans. Looking at that photograph now felt almost unbearable. I lowered myself carefully into Harold's leather chair and rested my fingers against the smooth wooden desk surface. For months after his death, I avoided this room because it carried too much of him inside it. But tonight something else lingered here too. Understanding. I finally understood why he spent so much time alone in this office during the past year. Why he looked exhausted even before the cancer diagnosis. Why certain conversations ended abruptly whenever Vanessa entered the room unexpectedly. He was protecting us while pretending everything remained normal. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Sophie standing hesitantly in the doorway holding a folded blanket against her chest. Her eyes still looked swollen from crying earlier. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. "Always." She entered slowly and sat in the chair across from the desk where Harold used to let her draw pictures while he balanced checkbooks on Sunday afternoons. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie looked around the office carefully and whispered, "I miss him." Chest tightened instantly. "So do I." She nodded silently while tracing one finger along the edge of the blanket in her lap. "Grandpa knew something was wrong, didn't he?" I considered lying for her sake. Protecting children becomes instinctive after a lifetime of motherhood. But Sophie was not really a child anymore. And lies had already poisoned this family enough. Quiet. At first, she just seemed stressed, Sophie continued. But then she started hiding stuff all the time. She would fight with Dad late at night after she thought I was asleep. Her voice trembled slightly now. One night, I heard her crying in the bathroom because somebody kept calling about money. I closed my eyes briefly. The image hurt more than I expected. Not because it excused Vanessa's actions. It did not. But because suffering and selfishness can exist inside the same person at the same time. Why did she hate you so much? Sophie whispered suddenly. That question broke something open inside me. Because until that moment, I had spent all my energy trying to understand money and lies and legal documents without allowing myself to face the deeper wound beneath all of it. My own daughter had looked at me with resentment for months, maybe years. I stared down at Harold's desk while old memories slowly resurfaced one by one. Vanessa as a teenager accusing me of loving rules more than freedom. Vanessa furious when Harold refused to pay for an expensive luxury apartment after college. Vanessa once screaming that we never understood pressure after she lost a sales promotion in Chicago years earlier. Back then, I dismissed those moments as temporary anger, ordinary family conflict. Now I wondered if resentment had been quietly growing inside her much longer than either Harold or I wanted to admit. "I do not think your mother hates me," I said carefully. Sophie looked unconvinced. Then why would she do this? Thought about Harold's video again. The sadness in his eyes. The disappointment. The exhaustion. Sometimes, I said slowly, people become so afraid of losing control that they stop seeing other people clearly. Sophie wiped quickly at her eyes. I barely recognize her anymore. Neither did I. Another silence settled between us while evening shadows stretched across the office walls. Then Sophie spoke again, much quieter this time. "There is something else you should know." My heartbeat slowed instinctively. "What is it?" She hesitated. "About 2 weeks ago, Mom had a meeting here with some guy from a lending company." I frowned immediately. A lending company? Sophie nodded. I heard them talking downstairs after school. He kept asking when the property transfer would be finalized. My stomach tightened hard. Did your father know about this? I do not think so. Sophie swallowed nervously. Mom told me not to mention it because she said Dad was already stressed enough. Another lie. Another secret. Pattern kept growing uglier every time new pieces surfaced. Did you hear anything else? Sophie nodded slowly. The man said something about penalties if the house sale got delayed. My pulse quickened sharply. Penalties meant contracts. Timelines. Financial commitments already made assuming the house would become available. Dear God. Vanessa had gone much further than even Howard realized. Before I could speak again, footsteps approached the office doorway. Brian appeared there looking exhausted and older somehow than he had that morning. He glanced between Sophie and me before speaking quietly. Can we talk? Kind of paperwork. Brian held several folded documents in his hand. Loan agreements. He laughed bitterly beneath his breath. Apparently my wife used the house as collateral during preliminary negotiations she had no legal authority to make. I stared at him in disbelief. Can she do that? No, he rubbed tiredly at his forehead. But she tried. He handed me the papers slowly. I recognized enough legal language immediately to understand the seriousness. Conditional financing agreements, estimated property liquidation values, deadlines, interest penalties. Vanessa had already promised lenders money she expected to receive once the house sold. My chest felt cold suddenly. Does Howard know? Brian shook his head. Not yet. Then he looked directly at me with genuine shame in his eyes. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I waited silently. I did not know how bad this had become. He swallowed hard before continuing. I knew we had debt. I knew Vanessa was stressed. But I thought we were dealing with maybe $30,000. 40 at most. He looked away briefly. I did not know she was gambling the entire future of this family on your house. Your house. Hearing those words from him mattered more than I expected. Because for months, everyone treated me like a temporary guest waiting to disappear quietly. Brian finally sat down across from Harold's desk and lowered his voice almost to a whisper. There is one more thing. Something in his expression made my heartbeat quicken instantly. What? He looked directly at me. Vanessa already signed a formal intent to sell agreement with a buyer in Denver 3 days ago. The room seemed to go completely silent around me. 3 days ago? Brian nodded weakly. And according to the contract, he paused briefly, like even saying the next part aloud made him sick. If the sale collapses because ownership cannot legally transfer, the financial penalties are massive. I stared down at the papers in my hands while a terrible realization settled slowly into place. Vanessa had not just endangered her inheritance anymore. She had built an entire financial collapse around a house she never legally controlled to begin with.